All right, welcome back, everyone. We are at it again today with an interesting topic that not that many people know about, which is the writings of Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, during all the tumult in Boston, during the Boston Tea Party, during the so called Boston Massacre. Thomas Hutchinson was the royal governor. He has quite an interesting story, and believe it or not, he is one of the most important American writers that we have in the period of the late 18th century, in the period of the American Enlightenment, despite being a figure that doesn't really share any of the major sympathies of the Enlightenment figures. As we're going to see, Bernard Bailyn, the famous American historian of the Constitution, actually calls Thomas Hutchinson a pre-modern figure, someone whose thinking is more in line with the medieval worldview, with the worldview of paganism, with the worldview of Christendom, the Christian synthesis, and is not so much influenced by the ideas of the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. He's a fascinating figure. He's a so-called loyalist. I don't really like the term. He's a Tory. He's against the idea of American independence, American separation, in spite of the fact that he is himself an American. He was born in Boston. He's about as Bostonian as it gets. In fact, he writes a very famous, very well-written, probably one of the most beautifully written texts we have by an American in the 18th century, a 3-volume history of Massachusetts as a colony. It's a fascinating document. We'll talk a little bit about it here, but today we're actually going to be looking at his Strictures Upon the Declaration, which is a series of line-by-line criticisms and responses to the Declaration of Independence. It's a really interesting text. It's not well known outside of historical studies, but we're going to look at it two ways today. We're going to look at it, one, as the product of an ideology that is contrary to the Enlightenment, something that helps us better understand the Enlightenment thinkers by seeing what they're working against, who their ideological opposites are, but also as an aesthetic text, because what you're going to notice is the aesthetics of this document are very, very different from the writings we've been looking at throughout this unit. So Benjamin Franklin, very colloquial, very affable, very friendly. Thomas Jefferson is obviously writing in a sort of more legal language, but it's still written at the level, not quite of the common man, but without all the sort of rhetorical flourish and formality that you would see that's typical of British writing during the 18th century. Well, Thomas Hutchinson, as you're going to see, is a writer in the Baroque style. His writing is never florid, but it is very polite, very mannered, very ornate, very intricate, which runs contrary to the sort of standard Bostonian aesthetic narrative, which goes back to the Puritan plain style and the things that we looked at in the unit on Puritanism. So we've got some really great stuff today, things that you're not going to hear about anywhere else. Hutchinson is almost never anthologized in a course on American literature. And in fact, even in most American history courses, they'll talk about Hutchinson a little bit, but they won't look at any of the primary source documents that Hutchinson produced during his tenure as royal governor. And so you're going to get a privileged glimpse at something really interesting today. So moving forward, what do we have about Thomas Hutchinson? What should we know about him? Got this little portrait over here on the left. He's born in Boston, as I mentioned, in the year 1711. He enters Harvard at the age of 12, which sounds extraordinarily precocious. It wasn't that crazy when we saw this with Cotton Mather. We'll see this later with Emerson. Usually sometime between the age of 12 and 16, a young man enters Harvard. But what it does mean is that he knew Latin and Greek at a very young age. He was very well educated. He was brought up in a well-to-do family. He gets married. Because after his time at Harvard, he decides to become a merchant. He's very successful. Later in life, I believe he's in his early 30s, he gets married to Margaret Sangford. He has 12 children, only 5 of whom survive. So right early on, we have personal tragedy in the life of Thomas Hutchinson. And as you're going to see, that tragedy doesn't stop anytime soon. His wife is going to die in childbirth. Again, a very typical 16th century, 17th century, 18th century death. She dies giving birth essentially to the 12th child, which is, I believe, also the exact same thing that happened to John Donne. I think John Donne's wife, Anne Donne, died giving birth to the 12th child. In any case, he never remarries. He honors his widow's memory and, his deceased spouse memory, and remains a widower for the rest of his life. And he goes on to sort of devote all of his time and energy to politics and to the state, well, not the state, but the province of Massachusetts. So he starts writing the 3-volume history of the province of Massachusetts Bay, a history of Massachusetts from the earliest times right up to the time of his own reign as royal governor, which is what the 3rd volume, which is released posthumously, covers. And he has somewhat of a tumultuous reign because he doesn't get along with some of the major incipient revolutionary Whig smuggler figures in Massachusetts. This would be the Otises. This would be both Adams, John Adams and Sam Adams. This would be John Hancock, right? These sort of proto-revolutionary figures, at least during the time of Hutchinson's tenure as a political figure in Massachusetts, who get into trouble for the law for various reasons that we will get into in just a little bit. And in one notable encounter, when Thomas Hutchinson has Otis convicted for smuggling, right? He does a search and seizure. He finds out that Otis is in fact smuggling. The response from Bostonians is quite violent. They ransack Hutchinson's mansion in 1765 in response to this particular event, and also to the sort of tumult around the Stamp Act, which hopefully you remember from American history was quite controversial. Hutchinson, believe it or not, actually was not in favor of the Stamp Act as a personal political project. He supports it and upholds it because, as his duty as royal governor, he has to. But in private, he's constantly urging the British authorities, hey, look, this is not going to work. Here's the on-the-ground circumstances that maybe you don't understand about Massachusetts, with these sort of crazy Puritan figures that Hutchinson prior had been having trouble with. So, for example, after what we call the French and Indian War, really the 7 Years' War, what happens? You have a large number of French Canadian Catholics who are forced to flee from Nova Scotia, and Hutchinson actually welcomes them with open arms in Boston, something that ends up being very controversial because, as you can imagine, Hutchinson, who is religiously High Church Anglican, gets into trouble with the Congregationalist ministers who don't want anything to do with Roman Catholics, whereas Hutchinson, ironically, in spite of not being an Enlightenment figure, is actually very religiously tolerant. And you're going to see, this is something I've mentioned earlier, religious and confessional lines do map up onto political differences. The low church factions, particularly in New England, tend to be the patriots. They support the Whig parties, they support independence. Whereas the Catholics and the High Church Anglicans, broadly speaking, typically in the South and Virginia, though Hutchinson would be an exception, they tend to be loyalists, or properly speaking, Tories. They're against the idea of independence. The ransacking of his mansion is really quite violent. Does, let's see here, 2,200 pounds of damages, which are assessed. And if you look at that in terms of contemporary interest rates, what that would be in US dollars, you're looking at about $825,000 of damage to his colonial mansion, which also had sort of architectural aesthetic value as well. I don't know much about colonial architecture, but apparently there were certain, his mansion was considered sort of a, what would you call it, a masterpiece of certain colonial styles. And so it was a major tragedy that it was ransacked. And we actually have Peter Oliver, who's another famous loyalist. He writes a brief little excursus in his larger text, Origins and Progress of the American Rebellion, on what happened in 1765 to Hutchinson. And I think it's quite revealing. I'm actually going to read it out loud for you now. In this year, 1765, began the violent outrages in Boston, and now the effusions of rancor from Mr. Otis's heart were brought into action. It hath been said that he hath secured the smugglers and their connections as his clients, an opportunity now offered for them to convince government of their influence, as seizure had been made by breaking open a store, agreeable to act of Parliament. It was contested in the Supreme Court, where Mr. Hutchinson presided. The seizure was adjudged legal by the whole court, so a sort of summary of what I've already mentioned. And then going forward, this is quite interesting. This raised resentment against the judges. Mr. Hutchinson was the only judge who resided in Boston, and he only of the judges was the victim. So he's sort of considered a traitor to the Bostonian idea, which is why you see he's very unpopular in Boston for his prior political career and then later as royal governor. He is not well liked by the sort of Congregationalist low church or descendants of the Congregationalist low church crowds, because he upholds essentially the laws of Parliament. He does what he's supposed to do as royal governor. Good. So for a short time after, the mob of Otis and his clients plundered Mr. Hutchinson's house of its full contents, destroyed his papers, that would be the first 2 volumes of the history of Massachusetts, unroofed his house, and sought his and his children's lives, which were saved by flight. One of the rioters declared next morning that the first places which they looked into were the beds, in order to murder the children. And so, if you're American and you're watching this, and even if you're British, because I don't think the British perspective is even taught in the British Isles anymore on the American Revolution. But in any case, like, if you go back to the way the American Revolution was taught, it's this nonviolent protest, tea in the harbor, ha ha ha, no taxation without representation, whatever. We're going to get into a lot of that with the strictures. But you see here in 1765 what is done in response to what is a totally legal search and seizure, the type of search and seizures that happen all the time, for example, in airports in the United States. Not a lot of people know this, but when you cross into a border in the United States, even if it's in an airport, so say you land in whatever, Los Angeles, you land in Houston, you land in Chicago, and you go through the border crossing, it is totally legal for the border agent to ask for your phone, to take your phone, and to make an entire copy of all of the contents on your phone for them to essentially use. And they can hold that for up to 10 years. And there is no, they don't have to have a particular reason. Because it's a border, the Supreme Court has ruled, they don't have to go through the same standards of having some sort of reasonable suspicion that you're doing some wrong. They can do this to anyone. They can do this randomly. And it's really quite interesting that actually, if you look at the statistics on this, 40,000 of these phones are seized each and every year. And it can happen to anyone. It can happen to a U.S. citizen. It can happen to a legal permanent resident, so on and so forth. So the whole unauthorized search and seizure thing is quite interesting in this context. In any case, they do a search and seizure of this particular storehouse. They find out that Otis is indeed a smuggler, and they prosecute him, which is somewhat to be expected, right? Well, what is the response in Boston? It is to burn down Thomas Hutchinson's house and to try to murder his children with axes, which is not exactly what you're taught in an American history course. So, which is why I think it's interesting, is like we don't often get the Loyalist, quote unquote, perspective, or the perspective of the Tories, the people who essentially supported the monarchy, did not want separation or independence. And I think reading Thomas Hutchinson in this regard is very illustrative. In any case, Peter Oliver goes on, all of this was a joy to Mr. Otis, as also to some of the considerable merchants who were smugglers and personally active in the diabolical scene. But a grave old gentleman thought it more than diabolical, for upon viewing the ruins on the next day, he made this remark vis-a-vis, excuse me, that if the devil had been there last night, he would have gone back to his own regions, ashamed of being outdone, and never more set foot upon the earth. If so, what pity he did not take an evening walk at that unhappy crisis, for he hath oft since seen himself outdone at his own outdoings. So what Peter Oliver is suggesting here is that this is a sort of diabolical scene, and what you're going to notice is Hawthorne mentions this numerous times in his short stories. So when we get to Romanticism, and in particular the Gothic, we'll read My Kinsman Major Molyneux, which is explicitly about the American Revolution, and Legends of the Province House, where Hutchinson actually shows up as a character. But in both instances, this event is mentioned in Hawthorne's own writing as this sort of diabolical inversion, as this really sort of like satanic evil event, because most people don't realize this. Hawthorne himself was a very major critic of the American Revolution, of the narrative around the revolution, and the treatment of Hutchinson is something that comes up in that particular author. So this is a good thing to note about early on. Good. Continuing forward here. Let's see. Will it let me go to the next slide? There we go. Yeah. Patriotism or terror. So this is Noam Chomsky. I'm sure you know. He's originally a linguist, but became a sort of leftist critic of, particularly of American foreign policy. And he has some interesting things to say about the events of the American Revolution that I think line up very much with what Peter Oliver was saying here earlier. He says, this clarifies something that I said earlier in a previous lecture. The percentage of colonists who fled in the American Revolution was actually about 4%. It was probably higher than the percentage of Vietnamese who fled Vietnam after the Vietnam War. Interesting. And I mentioned there are numerous similarities between the American Revolutionary conflict, which is really a civil war, and the Vietnam conflict, particularly if you look at it from the English perspective. There's a great book on this I would highly recommend reading. It's long, but it's very good. The Men Who Lost America. And if you read The Men Who Lost America, it's a book that only came out, I think, maybe a decade ago, maybe a little bit more than a decade. But if you read it, you see very quickly, it's like, oh my goodness, if you look at the discussions that are happening in Parliament between the Whigs and the Tories, between men like Pitt, Fox, Burke, who are all supporters of the American Revolution, and those who are against the American Revolution, you see that it's a sort of divided morale, that there's a large party in England who actually supports the revolutionary ideas and who does not want to waste resources and get involved in this conflict. And to that extent, it does like sort of bring back the Vietnam flashback of, okay, there's a similar narrative going on the home front in both of these conflicts. In any case, and remember, they were fleeing from one of the richest places in the world. These were boat people who fled in terror from Boston Harbor in the middle of winter to Nova Scotia, where they died in the snow trying to get away from all the crazies here. The number are supposed to have been in the neighborhood of maybe 100,000 out of a total population of about 2.5 million, maybe 3 million is a more accurate estimate. So it was a substantial part of the population. And among them were people from groups who knew they were going to get it in the neck if the colonists won, blacks and Native Americans, for example. And this is a point that Hutchinson is actually going to make clear a little bit later on. And they were right. In the case of the Native Americans, it was genocide. In the case of the blacks, it was slavery. Because not a lot of people realize this, but when we think of like, okay, who are the Loyalist supporters? I think most people in their mind have this French revolutionary narrative that it's, you know, the poor, salt of the earth Americans against this oppressive, rich class of British colonial, whatever, administrators who hate them and just want to tax the guts out of them. And nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, what you see is quite interesting. It's and this is true of pretty much every revolutionary conflict. If you look at the Latin American revolutions, this is certainly true. If you look at the French Revolution, this is certainly true. Almost every, if you look at the Russian Revolution, this is also true. Almost every revolution is perpetrated by the middle class. It's supported primarily by the middle class. So this goes against the Marxist narrative of history, but it's the middle class who tends to be the revolutionary class. And so what's really interesting is the highest class and the lowest class tend to be the most conservative, which is not totally surprising if you think about it. But in this case, it's true. The richest and the sort of highest, like most well-born, most well-educated families are very much Tory, are very much in favor of not having separation or independence. But also the poorest of the poor, blacks, Native Americans, and like sort of, again, salt of the earth, poor farmers, tended to support the monarchy against the rebellion against the so-called patriots. It's mostly the middle class, the people who had the most to gain from this, the large landowners, like sort of not quite gentry, right, but sort of what the equivalent of in the Middle Ages, what would have been yeoman farmers, the tobacco farmers in Virginia, as well as merchants and smugglers are very much in favor of the revolution. But they're numerically a minority. It's only that middle sandwich that has this revolutionary fervor and has the most to gain from revolution. The lower classes are very much conservative and recognize that they don't have a lot to gain in this conflict. If you have questions on that, definitely put those down below in the chat or the comments. I would love to answer them. A little bit more on Hutchinson's biography before we get to the text. As mentioned earlier, he is a major enemy of John Adams, Sam Adams, the Otis's, Hancock. Hancock's going to come up in Hawthorne numerous times. Nathaniel Hawthorne is a big enemy of John Hancock. His treatment in Legends of the Province House, you're going to see, is hilarious, if not a bit sad. The governorship of Hutchinson oversees the Boston Massacre, so-called, and the Tea Party. He obviously has to resign his governorship for fear of his life. He goes into exile in England. He dies in England in 1780. He's quite unhappy in England because the Whigs there, the English Whigs, who are in favor of the American Revolution, basically torture him, mock him, do everything they possibly can to make his life miserable. And as I mentioned earlier, Bernard Bailyn calls him an American pre-modern thinker. So we have someone who's born in America, but whose ideology is not primarily shaped by the Enlightenment, who goes back to earlier forms of thinking that have much more to do with monarchy, with hierarchy, with conceptions of duty, rather than conceptions of rights. And we're going to see that come up numerous times in the Strictures. And that shows up aesthetically as well. So instead of being an inheritor of the Puritan plain style, like Benjamin Franklin very much is, he is much more of an inheritor of the Baroque. You're going to see these sort of long, flowing sentences, the multiple dependent clauses, very sort of ornate, intricate language that's typical of the writing of Tories. It should bring to mind a little bit of Samuel Johnson, though somewhat different. But you'll see, I think his prose style is very beautiful. And yeah, so one of the major objections early on to the Declaration of Independence, which of course is what the Strictures is responding to. The Strictures comes out, I'll skip to this slide, October of 1776 in England. It's originally written as an anonymous pamphlet. Hutchinson doesn't sign his own name to it. He addresses it to the MP, Philip York, 2nd Earl of Hardwicke, and it's a line-by-line refutation of the Declaration. It's short, it's maybe about 35 pages. You have an opening where he says, hey, here's why I'm writing this, and then he literally just quotes from the Declaration, and every single point that the Declaration makes, Hutchinson refutes it and says, look, based on what I experienced as Royal Governor of Massachusetts, nobody knows more about this than me. Because, and this is quite interesting, because there's two parts of this. So the first thing you're going to see is when he's writing to Philip York, he says, look, I know you don't get what the Declaration is about because, and this is something we don't often think about, most Englishmen, when they read the Declaration and they're looking at all these different claims that are made, they go, what are these people talking about? They actually could not find the references to the particular grievances. Like, okay, there's this grievance. Well, when did that happen? What could they even be referring to? And Hutchinson, who knows the game, who obviously was involved in this conflict in a very personal and intimate way for years and years and years, says, okay, here's what they're trying to say. And let me explain to you, and then let me refute what they're trying to say as being nonsense, essentially. Because people in England did not understand what the Declaration is about. And most of us, when we think about the Declaration, we think about the opening lines. When in the course of human events, blah, 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 blah. And we think, okay, this is a sort of transcendental statement about the nature of human rights, oppression, tyranny, so on and so forth. But we don't think about it as a set of literal historical claims that are being made. And now, in this lecture, we're not going to evaluate the historical claims. I'm not trying to be a historian here. We're trying to look at this text as primarily an ideological text and as a literary text. Though I will say, not entirely incidentally, I do think the historical claims that Hutchinson makes are correct. You can dispute that. That would be an interesting conversation to have. But ignoring the history for a moment, what we're trying to get at here is the fact that Hutchinson is treating these claims seriously. And he's treating them as like, no, okay, there is a list of grievances, and we're going to respond to the grievances. I think most Americans who have not actually read the Declaration, they think of the Declaration as a transcendental philosophical document. And when people read it, they're actually surprised that, whoa, this is actually a list of they're not super specified, but it's a list of claims and grievances, which tends to come as a surprise to most of my students, and I think to most Americans more broadly. We talked about the style. Good. And so one of the major issues is this idea of all men are born equal, which in England, particularly by the Tories, is taken to be this sort of laughable thing. And I've got this quote here from Gentleman's Magazine, not what you think of when you think of a Gentleman's Magazine. Gentleman's Magazine, the issue September 1776. This is quite funny. We hold, they say, these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. In what are they created equal? Is it in size, strength, understanding, figure, civil or moral accomplishments, or situation of life? With this rhetorical question, with the answer being no. Like, in what aspect are people actually born equal? You could think about this. It's quite interesting and illustrative. In any case, let's actually get into the strictures. So this is the opening paragraph in the initial address that Hutchinson gives us. Let's read this out loud. The last time I had the honor, notice, you can't even imagine Ben Franklin talking like this. The last time I had the honor of being in your lordship's company, you observed that you were utterly at a loss to what facts many parts of the Declaration of Independence published by the Philadelphia Congress referred, and that you wish they had been more particularly mentioned, that you might better judge of the grievances alleged as special causes of the separation of the colonies from the other parts of the empire. So again, he's like, I know that you don't know what the Declaration is referring to, and that you are actually trying to assess the grievances and say what can be done to redress them. And so you want to figure out what are these vague claims in reference to. Hutchinson goes on, this hint from your lordship induced me to attempt a few strictures upon the Declaration. Upon my first reading it, I thought there would have been more policy in leaving the world altogether ignorant of the motives to this rebellion than in offering such false and frivolous reasons in support of it. And I flatter myself that before I have finished this letter, your lordship will be of the same mind. But I beg leave first to make a few remarks upon its rise and progress. I beg leave, right? Notice, very polite, courtly, courteous language. This is not in any way the writings of Jefferson or the writings of Franklin. But going back to what he's saying, if I were the framers of the Declaration, I wouldn't have put this out because I think it would be better to just not justify the rebellion and just do the rebellion than give a bunch of fake reasons for it. So he's already alerting the reader to the fact that he thinks all of the grievances are not legitimate, that they're fake. And he goes on to say, the acts for imposing duties and taxes may have accelerated the rebellion. Okay, so here, this is a little bit further on, he's addressing the claim that this is primarily about taxes. Because most of us, when we're taught why the American Revolution happened, we're told no taxation without representation. This is like the sort of standard. It's like, if you can do what did they say about O.J. Simpson? If you can bust a rhyme, you don't have to do the time. If the glove doesn't fit, you must not acquit. There's something similar in the American Revolution. We learn from the time we're 5, 6, 7 years old, no taxation without representation, and that's all there is to it. Well, Hutchinson's going to say something quite interesting. He's saying, the duties and taxes may have accelerated the rebellion. So he is acknowledging, he's like, yeah, the Stamp Act, Sugar Act, so on and so forth, they probably did accelerate the rebellion. But, notice he's going to make a caveat. And if this could have been foreseen, perhaps, it might have been good policy to have omitted or deferred them. But I am of the opinion that if no taxes or duties had been laid upon the colonies, other pretenses would have been found for the exception to the authority of Parliament. So he's saying, this is actually an issue that goes independent of taxes. If these taxes had never been levied, if there had been no Stamp Act, there had been no Sugar Act, no Intolerable Acts, take your pick, he's saying the rebellion still would have happened. And so this is one of his central claims, is that the motives that we have for the American Revolution, that we learn about it being all about taxes, he says this is propaganda. These are post hoc justifications for something that the revolutionary generation, the revolutionary class, the middle class, the smugglers, they already wanted. The middle class and the smugglers already wanted to be free of the monarchy. Now, why would they want to be free of the monarchy? This goes back to what we talked about in my lecture on the key vocab of the Enlightenment. They are in favor of laissez-faire, they're in favor of free trade, and they are against the idea of mercantilism. They don't want to have a command economy run out of the British Isles, where the British Isles, the British government, the monarchy, the crown effectively says, you cannot trade with Spain, you can't trade with Portugal. And this is quite interesting, is what is the standard token nationalistic drink for Americans right up through the 1820s? In the period of 1760, 1770, right through 1820s. It's Madeira wine. It's a wine from Portugal. Well, why would that be a symbol of revolutionary fervor? You're thinking, well, shouldn't they be drinking something American beer, whatever, your proto-Sam Adams? Like, why is the revolutionary drink or the nationalistic drink to have a glass of Portuguese wine? Well, the reason is drinking Portuguese wine means that you are specifically flouting the mercantilist laws, because from the mercantilist perspective, you trading and giving good money or your goods and services to the Portuguese in order to get Portuguese wine basically means you are helping an enemy of the British crown, granted not a huge enemy. Portugal is pretty friendly with England, but you're helping essentially a geopolitical enemy of the British, the Portuguese, in favor, or rather instead of doing the nationalistic thing, which is buying goods from your own country. And so the smugglers are, of course, in favor of free trade. They just want to make a profit. They want to trade with whoever they want. Britain restricts this and says you can't trade with the Dutch. You certainly can't trade with the Spanish. Don't trade with the French. Don't trade with the Portuguese. Only trade with us. You have a nationalistic obligation to help out your mother country. And so yes, that may mean you can't drink Spanish wine. Yes, that may mean you can't buy Dutch tea. Yes, it may mean that you have to pay duties and taxes. But we're doing this for your own good so that we can support your defense, as we did in the French and Indian War, and so that we can be a strong, a strong empire that can fight off our geopolitical enemies. And so you have a patriotic obligation not to believe in free trade. Even if it means your goods have to become more expensive, even if it means you have to spend more of your income paying taxes, even if it means you can't trade with people who you want, we're restricting your freedom in this regard in order to give certain public and collective goods that we could not otherwise give. And so the no taxation without representation thing, in any case, for Hutchinson is sort of, it's a red herring. He says they're not really concerned about the taxes. What they want is total independence from the monarchy. They want to be able to control things and run things as they want, to have complete free trade, and to not have the monarchy intervening in their economic affairs primarily in any way. They want autonomy. And so they make a post hoc justification of the taxes because it sounds good, because the common man can hear it and support it, to do what they've wanted to do, Hutchinson's going to claim, since the 1740s and 1750s, which is become independent. In any case, he goes on, the body of people in the colonies I know were easy and quiet. So most people in the colonies, he says, were not in favor of independence and revolution, which is true, which is actually very true if you look at it demographically. They felt no burdens. They were attached, indeed, in every colony to their own particular constitutions, but the supremacy of Parliament over the whole gave them no concern. They had been happy under it for 100 years past. They feared no imaginary evils for 100 years to come. But there were men in each of the principal colonies who had independence in view before any of those taxes were laid or proposed, which have been since the ostensible cause, meaning not the actual cause, the ostensible cause of resisting the execution of the Acts of Parliament. And Hutchinson continues, I have, by this special reason, my lord, I have this special reason, my lord, for taking notice of this act of Massachusetts Assembly, that though an American representation is thrown out as an expedient which might obviate the objections to taxes upon the colonies, yet it was only intended to amuse the authority in England. So here, this is in a specific section where he's talking about the Stamp Act and his personal experience. He's saying, he's like, look, they throw this expedient to obviate objections to taxes upon the colonies, right? He essentially says, look, the colonies' position is they're saying, oh, if we have representation, we won't be upset. Here are ways we can fix this relationship. But what he's saying this is just fake. The colonists are pretending, oh yeah, if you just gave me this as a bargaining chip, I would do whatever you say. If you just let us have some representation, we would be happy. And Hutchinson's claim is that's false. They're asking, oh, just please, just be clement in this one issue. When in reality, they don't really care about the issue. The taxation is not the issue. They're using this as a justification to get the thing that they really want, which is complete and total independence. Good. Yet it was only intended to amuse the authority in England. And as soon as it was known to have its advocates here, it was renounced by the colonies and even by the assembly of the colony which first proposed it as utterly impracticable. In every stage of the revolt, the same disposition has always appeared. No precise, unequivocal terms of submission to the authority of Parliament in any case have ever been offered by any assembly. So, in other words, he says the American colonies have never gone to Parliament at any point prior to the Revolution and say, look, if you concede us this, we promise to accept the authority of Parliament and everything else. He says no one ever said, look, just give us this and we'll let Parliament have its authority over us and all these other things. Because why? That was never the goal. The goal was always independence. A concession has only produced a further demand. And I give this example, I think it's worth going into here. It's the child in the grocery store, okay? Everyone has seen this. Because why? You don't, what the lesson that you see when a child is screaming in the grocery store that you should take away is that as parents, you normally don't make concessions, particularly with small children who are irrational, who are being petulant, who are being emotional. You impose rules. You don't make concessions, you impose rules. Because why? Making a concession is often surrendering power. And making too many concessions and making false promises and so on, it's just a complete surrender of power. So think about the child in the grocery store. You're going to the checkout line and child starts screaming, I want candy. And the initial concession is made, oh, just be quiet, I'll give you candy when we get home. Oh, but I want candy now, right? And the parent starts entering this bargaining relationship where what they're trying to do is to get the child to stop screaming. And they make concession after concession after concession, and the child holds all the power in the negotiating relationship because the parent is just going to keep offering concessions until the child stops screaming. Whereas what really needs to be done is to change the frame, the narrative around this particular event, and to change the goal. What I would say a good parent does is instead of trying to get the child to stop screaming, the goal is to get the child to learn the lesson that they don't get to make demands, they don't get to decide what the parents purchase, and that you don't get to scream in public. So, the proper thing to do is, even if it's embarrassing, let the child scream, and then in the car or at home, offer some form of punishment. But to let the child continue screaming, but to just make no movement towards the, oh, I'll give you candy when we get home. Oh, if you're just quiet for the next couple minutes, I promise I'll buy you candy, right? Or if you promise you clean your room, I'll get you candy, right? I'll do whatever you say. I'll do what you want. Those parents are scared of their children, and the inmates end up running the asylum, which is a claim Hutchinson's going to make later. He says, it's the most ridiculous thing in the American Revolution because it's the inmates running the asylum. It's the governed deciding they are now going to be the governors. It's a total flip of Hutchinson's perceived justness of the hierarchical worldview, of the monarchical worldview. But in any case, it's like, if you go back to the instance of the kid screaming in the grocery store, the kid holds all the power if the goal is to get the kid to stop screaming. Because as long as the kid is screaming, there are still bargaining chips on the table. There are still more concessions that can be demanded. And if no punishment is offered, or if a light punishment is offered or whatever, but concessions are still given, it's still a net win for the child. Whereas if the parent stonewalls, just gives no response at all to the child, and then goes home and punishes them, well, they've obtained nothing. And actually they've been the loser by this interaction. Or if the parent just keeps saying, nope, 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 and there's no bargaining, well, then the child has to learn its lesson. And this is one of Hutchinson's major objections to George III's government. He's not a unambiguous supporter of George III's policy. He actually says some of the taxes are excessive and unjust, and Hutchinson's also going to say Effectively, George III should have been way harsher with the colonies right from the beginning and just have made concessions and said, we are not going to bargain. We paid for the defense of the colonies during the 7 Years' War. We've done all these different things for you. We see you as Englishmen. We're not coming to the bargaining table with you. You guys just have to eat it. But he says effectively the response, partially because of divided parliament, partially because of George III's desire to appeal to the Whig sensibility, is to say, okay, we'll keep making concessions to the colonies. And the concessions actually just give the colonies more and more power. Just like concessions made to a child in the grocery store. The more concessions that are made, the more emotional energy that is invested in the interaction, the more the desire for the screaming to stop is made the primary narrative desire of this interaction and part of the framing, the more power the child is going to have. Whereas when the frame is now, I'm not entering into the bargain, I'm not conceding anything, the child immediately loses all that power. And in this case, the quote-unquote American patriots, the middle class of Boston, the smugglers, they are the screaming children. Good. Hopefully that makes sense. If that analogy was not clear, please leave a comment. A concession has only produced a further demand, and I verily believe it, everything to have been granted, short of absolute independence, they would have not been contented. So he says, look, if they had granted every single demand of the colonies, they would have kept asking for more until they got independence, because independence was always the goal. They would have never been happy. No matter how many nice things we give them, no matter how many nice things we do for them, they will never be happy. For this was not the object from the beginning. One of the most noted among the American clergy prophesied 8 years ago, that would have been in 1768, that within 8 years from that time, lo and behold, the colonies would be formed into 3 distinct independent republics, northern, middle, and southern. That would have obviated a lot of problems, but they didn't end up doing that. I could give your lordship many irrefragable proofs of this determined design, but I reserve them for a future letter, the subject of which shall be the rise and progress of the rebellion in each of the colonies. But that is not his goal here. Good. Moving forward. Now we're going to get into the part where Hutchinson is actually making his line-by-line response to the Declaration. So we have part of the Declaration, and we're going to have Hutchinson's response. So he starts with the opening, which is natural, and we all have probably heard this opening at some point before. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And Hutchinson's response to this, like, we take this as just sort of like a transcendental statement that doesn't really mean anything. We are going to give the reasons why we're rebelling. We are fighting against tyranny. We are fighting against people who deny human rights, whatever. Whereas Hutchinson's going to actually take this claim seriously and break it down. And his response is, as is true in other places throughout the Strictures, I think is quite funny. Is almost laugh out loud funny. Okay, what is Hutchinson going to say? They begin, my lord, with a false hypothesis that the colonies are one distinct people and the kingdom another, connected by political bands. So this is fascinating, right? Because if we go back, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. So he's saying they're entering a narrative frame with the Declaration whereby there's one people, the British, and there's another people, the Americans, that are two separate, distinct peoples, in the sense of like the Spanish word pueblo. Like they're two distinct nations, where in fact there's only one nation. They're all British subjects. They're all British subjects. If you're born in Massachusetts, if you're born in South Carolina, if you're born in Jamaica, and if you're born in, I don't know, take your pick. If you're born in London, you are a British subject. And this is his point. He's like, there's no distinction here. We are all British. We all belong to the same nation. We speak the same language. There are no two separate nations. This is a paper fiction. So he goes on to say, the colonies politically considered never were a distinct people from the kingdom. There has never been but one political band, and that was the same before the first colonists emigrated, as it has been ever since, the supreme legislative authority, which hath essential right and indispensably bound to keep all parts of the empire entire, until there may be a separation consistent with the general good of the empire, of which good, from the nature of government, this authority must be the sole judge. So again, the principal authority since the time of the Glorious Revolution has always been Parliament. Parliament has supreme legislative authority. And in fact, what's funny about that is part of what the Glorious Revolution did, and Hutchinson mentions this in a later section of the Strictures that I actually didn't include in this lecture. You can go read it for yourself. But one of the interesting things that Hutchinson points out is he says, how funny is it that the Puritans during the time of the Glorious Revolution were going, yes, yes, please give us supreme legislative authority, limit the power of the monarch. Yes, we want the legislative authority to be able to dissolve the monarchy if it's necessary, which was true, which was a provision that was made during that particular time period. And Hutchinson mentions that later as well. He says, now, lo and behold, how interesting is it that the descendants of the Puritans, who were so happy to make Parliament the supreme legislative authority, are now willing to say, no, there's a higher legislative authority than Parliament, and that's effectively popular sovereignty. This is quite interesting. What a shift from the same group of people in just 100 years' time. It's almost like they can't be satisfied with anything. I should therefore be impertinent if I attempted to show in what case a whole people may be justified in rising up in oppugnation to the power, good word, oppugnation, to the powers of government, altering or abolishing them, and substituting in whole or in part new powers in their stead, or in what sense all men are created equal, right, mentioned earlier, or how far life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness may be said to be inalienable. I love this. You got to admire his cheek and sense of humor right here. Only I could wish to ask the delegates of Maryland and Virginia and the Carolinas how their constituents justify the depriving of more than 100,000 Africans of their rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and in some degree their lives, if these rights are so absolutely unalienable. Which is hilarious, right? I mean, it's an objection that we all understand now, but he's like, oh, so you guys are going to say you believe in the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that these are inalienable rights that are given by our Creator. Now, Hutchinson is going to say, I'm going to ignore the issue of whether or not I actually believe that. Because Hutchinson doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe, he's not conceiving things from the doctrine of rights. He doesn't think that way. He's thinking more along the medieval lines of duties and obligations. But in any case, he says, oh, you believe in unalienable rights, that all human beings are created equal, that we have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, the 100,000 Africans in the South who are in chattel slavery, you can decide who they marry. You can decide what religion they are. You can essentially treat them like animals. Oh, I'm sure you believe in their unmitigated right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He's like, no, this is sarcasm, right? He's like, this is ridiculous. Now, going back to the issue of no taxation without representation, we continue. How often has your lordship heard it said that the Americans are willing to submit to the authority of Parliament in all cases except that of taxes? So basically, what he's saying is, in England, there's this discourse that the revolutionaries are in favor of submitting to Parliament in every authority except taxes. It's like, look, we love having Parliament govern over us. We love Parliament making laws and acting as a supreme legislative authority. Just please allow us to have representation in issues of taxes. And he's going to say, this is a joke. This is not real. Here we have a declaration made to the world of the causes which have impelled separation, and that if any one cause was distinguished from another, special notice would be taken of it. That of taxes seems to have been in danger of being forgot. Because notice, he's pointing out, he's like, if you read the declaration, there are all these grievances, which earlier in the Strictures Hutchinson responds to and says they're just garbage. But taxes doesn't come up until almost the end of the document. And so he says that of taxes seems to have been in danger of being forgot. Taxes were so important in the build-up to the revolution, and now that the revolution has happened and there's this Declaration of Independence, why is it taxes are so far down the list? And it's only a sentence where it's mentioned. It comes in late and is slight a manner as possible. And I know, my lord, that these men in the early days of their opposition to the Parliament have acknowledged that they pitched upon the subject of taxes because it was most alarming to the people, every man perceiving immediately that he is personally affected by it. So why do they pick taxes as the critical issue? Why do we get this nice little rhyme of no taxation without representation? Well, because everyone hates taxes and everyone pays taxes. And so for that reason, it becomes a popular issue. Not everyone is going to be in favor of independence and having, the free trade smuggler's empire. But everyone's going to be in favor of lower taxes, and so they pick an issue for propagandistic reasons, because it's popular, not because it's the actual crux of the issue. And it has, therefore, in all communities, always been a subject more dangerous to government than any other to make innovation in. But as their friends in England had fallen with the idea that Parliament could have no right to tax them because not represented, they thought it best that they should be believed that they were willing to submit to other acts of legislation until this point of taxes could be gained. But of course, Hutchinson's saying they were not willing to submit to Parliament in other issues. This is just a paper fiction. Owing at the same time that they could find no fundamentals in the English Constitution which made representation more necessary in acts for taxes than in acts for any other purpose. But as this doctrine was held by their friends and was of service to their cause until they were prepared for total independence, they appeared to approve it. As they now have no further occasion for it, they take no more notice of an act for imposing taxes than of many other acts. For a distinction in the authority of Parliament in any particular case cannot serve their claim to a general exemption, which they are now preparing to assert. Right? So he says before they're like, we just want an exemption from taxation. We submit to Parliament and everything else. Well, now we have a document which says, no, we have this new entity, the United States, which is independent from British colonial authority. Well, now they're saying we refuse to submit to Parliament in anything. So Hutchinson says, because now they're rejecting the authority of Parliament whole cloth, they put the taxation issue as kind of like an embarrassing afterthought towards the end of the document. And he continues. Let's see if I can get this to work. Yeah. Continues. So this is towards the end of the strictures. Oh no, this is actually the wrong one. Special reason. Yeah, we already looked at this. Let's move here. So the claim from the Declaration is, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which defines a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So the statement that occurs towards the end of the Declaration. And Hutchinson's response here is very indignant. Indignant resentment must seize the breast of every loyal subject. A tyrant in modern language means not merely an absolute and arbitrary, but a cruel, merciless sovereign, which if you know anything about George III, it's like he is the least capable person of being a tyrant that you could possibly imagine. If anything, I would agree with Hutchinson. George III was just too weak of a monarch. That's part of the reason why there was so much tumult and struggle, is that he wasn't half the man his father was. Have these men given an instance of any one act in which the king has exceeded the just powers of the crown as limited by the English Constitution? Has he ever departed from the known established laws and submitted his own will as the rule of his actions? So he's saying they picked the king to be the figurehead of all evil because they're against monarchy and because the king is a figure that everyone can identify with and hate easily. It's hard to talk about Parliament as being the supreme legislative authority because how can you hate Parliament? It's an abstract entity. It doesn't have a personality. But if they make the focus on King George III rather than on Parliament and say George III is a tyrant, well, that raises a sort of popular consciousness, and that makes people who otherwise would have been indifferent to the American Revolution because they're not smugglers, they're not part of the middle class of merchants or tobacco farmers, now in favor of the revolution because, George III is taxing us and is acting like a tyrant. Hutchinson saying, you can't point to a single instance where George III has done anything tyrannical. He is totally bound by the absolute legislative authority of Parliament and has upheld the English Constitution. There are no instances in which he's broken with the English Constitution or not upheld the doctrines of Parliament. Has there ever been a prince by whom subjects in rebellion have been treated with less severity or with longer forbearance? Yeah. In other words, he was excessively forbearing with the revolutionaries, not harsh and cruel and tyrannical. Now, the conclusion of the document, the last lines before he signs off, is quite interesting. He says, gratitude, I am sensible, is seldom to be found in a community, but so sudden a revolt from the rest of the empire, which had incurred so immense a debt during the 7 Years' War, during the French and Indian War, and with which it remains burdened for the protection and defense of the colonies, and at their most importunate request, is an instance of ingratitude nowhere to be parallel. And you can feel the sort of personal resentment, the biographical, psychological element of what Hutchinson is saying. He's writing from exile. He's writing in England. And he's saying, all in all, the American colonists who supported revolution, the Whigs, the middle class, the merchants, the smugglers, the tobacco farmers, the Otises and Hancocks, they are ungrateful. They were given so many good things by the colonial government. The colonial government made concession after concession after concession, and they remain ungrateful and are acting like spoiled, petulant children. The same way that the parent who gives too many concessions to their child in the supermarket ends up raising a child who is spoiled, who is ungrateful, who can't control their own behavior, and who again, doesn't have gratitude for the things that they have. And now, whose fault is that? It's partially the parent's fault, is it not? And in this case, what he's saying is it's also partially, I think this is some of the implication, it's partially the fault of the British government, for one, being divided, but two, for making too many concessions to the colonists. He said, we should have been harsher from the very beginning. And when you read Legends of the Province House, particularly in the second legend of the Province House, Edmund Randolph's portrait, you'll see this is Hawthorne's conclusion too, is that effectively it's not that the colonial authority was too harsh with the colonists, with the people of Boston, so on and so forth, with the incipient revolutionaries, is that they weren't harsh enough. So in other words, it's the solution to the conflict is the opposite of what we think. It's not or this sort of oppressive government that's tyrannizing its people. Rather, it's the parent who just gives in to all the demands of the child. And so Hutchinson signs off here. You can feel his bitterness. You can feel also that he senses there's a certain lack of gratitude from the people of Massachusetts towards him, towards all the good things he tried to do in his tenure in Massachusetts politics. And of course, he was someone who loved Massachusetts dearly, in spite of the fact that he did not share all of its ideology, that he was not a Puritan. He writes the history of Massachusetts out of love for this particular colony. And the response that he gets from history is to be totally forgotten, for no one to read the Strictures, for no one to read his history, which is just, it's a masterpiece. It's absolutely beautiful. And for no one to remember him, other than sort of specialized historians, which is quite sad. But today we have done our due diligence in alerting you to this text. I hope you go read it. If you have questions about anything I covered, I know it's somewhat complicated, please leave your comments down below. I love reading them. I'm happy to answer questions as always. I hope you found this lecture to be useful and that you got a lot out of it. Like and subscribe. And also, I would be remiss, don't forget to check out some of the programs I have below down in the description. What I want to highlight today is I have the College Degree Accelerator Program, which is awesome. We have some people working in it right now. It is a program that is complete with flashcard decks, weekly tutoring sessions, bi-weekly Q&A sessions, and tons of resources, including a 90-page ebook where I talk about how I graduated college in 2 years. I think most of you know I graduated college when I was 19 years old. I couldn't even drink. I got into a PhD program when I was 20. You can do the same thing. If you read the ebook, go through the program, get some coaching from me. I can help structure your time right now, whether you're just starting college or whether you're in high school, so that you can get on an accelerated track to graduate college, save yourself $35,000, $76,000 in some instances, and save yourself 2 years of your life so that you can get back to doing the things that you want to do, like travel, start a business, go to grad school, whatever, and do it a lot sooner. You don't want to be in school until the time you're 27. You want to get out of school. And if you want to get out of school, I am here to help you. So go take a look at that program down in the description. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you all around.